So the next session, we will discuss the decision-making process for developing SupTech applications in-house or outsourcing the development to an external provider, to a vendor. So the panelists will share insights on the pros and cons of both buy and build approaches and key consideration that the decision makers should take into account. Please keep coming your questions into the chat. We will do our best to answer as many as possible. And with this, I invite the panel to join me. The moderator will be Meg Grasser, the principal technologist of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance and co-head of the Cambridge SupTech Lab. And he is joined today by Sam Selim, the President and Chief Innovation Officer of SQL Power Group, and Carmel Cadet, the founder and CEO of MTech. Matt, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Simone. So I want to do a little bit of reframing to kick this session off, or maybe a little bit of a nuanced take to kick this session off. So we talk a lot about buy versus build, right? Like we're fighting, like, oh, I'm going to cheer for my team and then boo your team. But like really what we have here is a spectrum. And along this spectrum, we have compositions where we might have some components that are built, some components that are bought, and integration points between the two. So there's a really, really rich and broad diversity of approaches along this spectrum. And I think by boiling it down to buy versus build, we kind of lose that diversity. And that's really important to building resilient solutions. So we'll try to get into this in some depth today with a couple of experts on the call. But yeah, like I think some factors that play into this decision, you might build if you have the bandwidth or technical capacity to do so, or if you have enough time to build something before launch versus kind of procuring something off the shelf very quickly. You might need certain infrastructure to be able to build off of versus being able to buy it. So there's a bunch of different considerations if you're thinking about building something. In terms of buying, maybe that's your default if you don't have one or more of those build factors, and if you have the budget available to do so. So that's just some high level kind of points that we'll dive into in the panel today. But of course, behind these agency level considerations, the decision also depends not only on the capabilities or willingness of an agency to kind of build or buy, but also the particular technology at hand. So depending on the type of solution you're looking at, building and maintaining, say, an API is very different than building and maintaining a multilingual chatbot. Data-driven machine learning models have significantly different deployment and maintenance requirements than like more legacy rule-based kind of if-then-else type software. So there's this agency level consideration, technology level consideration. I hope to dive into these things today. So just the last bit of context, we know from our last two global State of SupTech surveys and reports that's based on our global community of supervisory agencies, that most solutions identified by financial authorities as SupTech are currently procured from vendors. However, a very significant portion, approaching plurality, are being built. So this could be driven by the fact that many of the supervisors' top priorities has been to build capacity through trainings, like those offered through the lab or the EU SDFA or others, acceleration of the SupTech marketplace that we've been seeing, and increasingly prevalent open source software and data models, so commoditization of some of these tools as well. So it'll be interesting to see, as we continue this conversation, how the answers might evolve over time. But today, at this specific point in time, we have two very unique providers of SupTech solutions. And I say very unique because both Carmel's organization and Sam's organization somehow sit at like the very saddle point between these two ends of the spectrum, laying their sold solutions that are procured and bought on top of built legacy infrastructure and like really understand the nuances of each aspect of this. So it'll be really great to get their perspectives here today. So with that context, I think we can dive right in. So yeah, Carmel and then Sam, I'd be really interested to hear, in your perspective, if you can provide a little bit more context about your organization, and then in your perspective, what are the general kind of pros versus cons of buy versus build, or the different options along that spectrum? I mentioned a few components, but maybe you could go in more depth and add to that list as well. In particular, for a financial authority, like what are the most important factors to consider in deciding what components to build or buy or compose. So maybe we could start with Carmel and then over to Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think the context that you provided is really relevant. So my name is Carmel Cadet. I'm the founder and CEO of MTech. MTech, for a bit of background, really looks at central banks specifically. And many markets, they are also the regulators. And different markets have particular different structure on how they supervise the financial sector. But we look at central banks as a client segment, and when we think about their role as supervisors, is also looking at the regulatory environment that they create and the regulatory framework that they put in place, and also how they monitor and continue to supervise the licensed participants and stakeholders that are providing financial services. To that end, so when we started talking to regulators, really understanding some of the key pain points, yes, as a company, our mission really enables us to talk about how can we make financial markets more resilient and inclusive. And in that conversation, the resilience, what we really realized that as finance is becoming more digital and as finance is becoming also more niche to match consumer preferences, and as we become more global and more people travel, how do you as a supervisor continue to provide and play a role that can ensure that consumers will have some level of protection, fair pricing, and competition in the market that essentially underpins how consumer products are provided in a safe way and, of course, affordable way over time. It's not particularly that simple, but when you think about the role of the supervisor, doing that in a more modern way is also a requirement at this point. And as we talk to central banks and regulators, what they're looking for are modern tools on how they can do what they do better and faster in a more trusted way. And if you think about the current landscape of digitization, data is everything. So in order for you to mitigate risk management is at the core of what a supervisor essentially is looking to do. We need data, and Excel spreadsheets and emails are what I call pictures of data, not particularly being able to capture the value and the insight. You need an additional component to do that, especially compared to the legacy processes that a lot of regulators have. So to that end, our experience really tells us central banks are not tech companies, right? They don't particularly look at developing an R&D part of their approach. What usually happens is that you see a combination of what do we build internally, how do we continue to learn, how do we have internal resources to give us an eye on what we should be looking at and what are the opportunities that technology can provide us. But ultimately, when you think about the maintenance, the build, the maintenance, and the ongoing cost of maintaining or building a particular solution, I think every tech company or every tech founder or CEO of a company will tell you that it takes effort, it takes focus, it takes dedication, and it takes a lot of resources in order for you to maintain that value chain. It's not a matter of just building and launching, it's also a matter of maintaining and continuing to grow. So that combination is very, very key. What do you build internally versus what you buy? I think really depends on the regulator. We see a lot of requests for data protection and security and what is the framework around that. But central banks and regulators are very much looking at how can they leverage solutions to scale faster and to move faster into what they do, because it does take time to build from scratch.
Great, thank you, Carmel. Yeah, a couple of points I heard there are like really remaining relentlessly supervisor-centric and user-centric and impact-centric, making sure that you're focused on the risks that these tools get to provide and having that as kind of a North Star. And then, yeah, the point on maintenance post-launch is a really underappreciated point, and I'm really glad that you raised that. So, yeah, thank you. Sam, over to you to build on that or add to it.
Great, thank you, Matt. My name is Sam Salim. I'm the CEO and founder of SQL Power Group. We're a global software firm specializing in automating every aspect of financial regulation. Our platform is highly configurable, which means it's not the same solution isn't identically installed in different jurisdictions. Different jurisdictions have different needs, nuances, different requirements. So it's important that the platform obviously is configured to suit the client's specific needs. We automate every aspect of registration and licensing, financial data collection, on-site examination, risk assessment, off-site monitoring, and analytics. So we provide a complete end-to-end solution. For the purpose of this discussion, it's important to point out that even vendors, we don't always build from scratch. So, it makes sense for us to build a primary component that integrates with other industry leaders that can bring ready-made functionality to the table. So, for example, we OEM, a business intelligence tool because we're not in the BI space and we don't build business intelligence tools from scratch. We OEM an XBRL processing engine, but everything else around the user experience, we handle ourselves. The buy versus build discussion, obviously, what do you want to do? So there's the parameters that drive that decision, and the parameters are how much time do you have? Do you need to go to market in a year, or can you afford to build something that meets your exact requirements, but it may take 5 years? So the time frame is significant, the cost is significant, because obviously the buy solution is higher upfront cost, but lower total cost of ownership as you go out with a 10-year horizon. Whereas if you're building, your cost is your resources. So if you have 5 or 6 developers, that's your cost year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, who continue to maintain that. So over time, the cost stays the same, but you also don't leverage economies of scale. So vendors typically obviously have a support team that support multiple clients. So it's a lot cheaper for us to charge ongoing maintenance than it would be for you to do your own ongoing maintenance for your solution. So I would say, the primary factor is determining what time frame you have, because you need to address real business needs, and can you afford to wait 3 or 4 years before you can implement that functionality. Also, with the with a buy solution, with a buy choice, you're getting all the functionality day one. Whereas with a build solution, you're probably trickling in the functionality as time goes by, or as your team is able to deliver that specific functionality. Buy gives you a battle-tested solution, but build gives you a customized and tailored solution for your specific needs. With buy, you have a fixed and known cost ongoing, whereas with build, you don't really know the full cost until it's user acceptance tested and rolled out to production and has all the functionality you need. So there's risk there because you're not seeing what you're delivering up front. Whereas with buy, you obviously get demos, you do evaluations, you know what the solution exactly will do, and then you're guaranteed to get that functionality, 12 months or 18 months from now. So that's just at a high level, my perspective on buy versus build. You obviously, in both cases, have to go to market, have to understand your own requirements, you have to evaluate, you have to determine what you actually need versus a nice to have, and then you do a cost benefit analysis as to whether that's something you should pick up off the shelf because it's a lot cheaper to do so, or whether it's something that you should be building in-house because there's intellectual property and secret sauce type of thing that you want to maintain yourself.
Great, thank you, Sam. So I'm hearing a couple points that flow through both of your conversations, that like this isn't a decision to be made up front as a prescriptive idea. Like you don't go into a solution saying like, oh man, I'm ready to buy something. Like I'm gonna buy it and I've decided, now let's scope it out. It really sounds like what you guys are both describing is evaluate the problem at hand, understand what the value is needed here, get downstream, scope like the parameters of a solution, and then as a later stage decision, evaluate options for buying and building components of this. So that's one really interesting theme that I heard here. Another is actually that like buying a solution isn't necessarily only buying one solution, right? There's this composability aspect that Sam, you brought into the conversation here. So if I'm buying a platform or if I'm buying one set of tools, that very well may integrate with other vendors' tools or other tools that the agency has built. Or actually to one of the questions in the chat, which maybe is a good point to inject this question, open source software that can be used to build solutions or extend commercial solutions that are purchased off the shelf. So I'd be really interesting to hear your perspectives on this question. I know we want to hold kind of Q&A to the end, but I think this is a good point to consider, like, how do you, as commercial vendors of solutions, view open source? Is this like an ally in your work? Is it a threat to your commercial production? Like, how do you see open source software entering into this space and affecting the buy versus build questions? Maybe we can stick with you, Sam, for a moment, and then back to Carmel on this.
Yeah, there's two main attractiveness to open source. One, it's ready-made and it's free. So it depends on what you're planning to do with that open source software. For example, there are really strong open source ETL tools on the market that you're just using the executable. You're never really gonna go out and make changes to that because there's tens of thousands of lines of code and you don't really need to. You just want to use that functionality at a low cost. So open source is obviously can be attractive if it has the functionality you need. It becomes more challenging if you are planning to actually get your developers to roll up their sleeve, understand those 10,000 lines of code because they didn't write it, and then make changes to it with confidence and continue to maintain that aspect of it. So it's not a clear choice. Just because it's cheap, that doesn't mean it's the right decision type of thing. But we have had experience with LifeRay, which is an open source product, and we use it just by calling its API without changing its code per se. We bundle it as part of a solution, but we don't actually change the code.
Great, thanks, Sam. Over to you, Carmel. Oh, I think you're on mute.
One thing that I'll add to that is the open source, of course, still has a component of it that still needs to be maintained. And sometimes the dependability or the dependency, I should say, on open source software to continue to grow and continue to be aligned to what you need over time. I think that's probably the biggest risk in that space. But as Sam mentioned, really understanding what do you need as a supervisor internally in order for you to really leverage open source technology is key. And depending on what you build with it, we use open source technology in our solutions as we build for central banks. There are components to that are very valuable, scalable, and in a way, as a vendor, we bring that risk management and that risk mitigation to the central bank, and making sure that every component that goes into our software, that we know, we understand the risk associated with it, the maintenance required for it, and as part of our even contract terms, what we commit to provide in case a particular solution or a component of the overall software is no longer available or is no longer open source or so on. But open source is great. It's free, as Sam mentioned. And sometimes it plays a very specific role in a bigger solution. What we see is the need for customization or the configurability, if you will, when it comes to a central bank particular task, depending on what you're building for, depending on what problem you're solving in this big supervisory role, having a focus on what you're building, the component that you're building, and the dependency on open source.
Great, thank you for your insights. Yeah, I think this idea that you brought up earlier, Carmel, of like, you know, it's not just about launching software, I think applies equally to open source software. It's not just about publishing software online or just like plug and play consuming this software, but it's an act of contributing back to the software, you know, pulling in those patches. Yeah.
And one thing I'll add is that you can't buy it, right? And usually a supervisor or a regulator would want to buy something outright, and kind of this sense of ownership and control is very difficult in open software, software.
Yeah, that's a super interesting nuance to this too, that the licensing is an important consideration, and making sure that that's respected and bringing it in. So yeah, I think what I'm hearing is that it's another component to be considered, you know, alongside agencies building something and vendors selling stuff to be bought. There's this idea of open source that kind of can become a glue or another component that can be added into either end of the spectrum or anywhere along that. So yeah, that's wonderful. So I think shifting topics a little bit, you know, we've talked about some of the considerations, the different parameters that agencies might consider in, you know, making a decision along the build versus buy spectrum. I'm curious, you know, we see the benefits of RegTech and SupTech, particularly for financial supervisors with the emergence of, you know, big data coming in, the 4Vs and whatever else. But I'm curious if in your work you've noticed any distinctions between maybe more well-resourced agencies and those with more limited resources. And just to add a little bit of context, you know, the Cambridge SupTech Lab, we're very proud to have a global set of financial authorities that we work with on a regular basis. So we're based in the UK, of course, but we have a global team that's servicing a really, really diverse set of financial authorities, who are starting with very manual processes in some cases, and some who are working with very advanced processes and want to kind of expand on that. So I think much of the audience would be curious to hear, how do I adapt these parameters to my own agency, maybe as a smaller or less resourced agency?
Maybe I can start. Just we have a set of regulators that we're working with, and the first that we started with did not have a cloud strategy, for example. And our solution are cloud native solutions for central banks. So the second largest that we started working with has a cloud solution, they're a cloud native central bank. Neighbors, same region, but very different stages on adoption of cloud technology. And sure enough, there's a bit of education and capacity building that you have to build as you're not only explaining what the product can do and how they can solve a particular problem that they have, but what does cloud deployment mean? However, seeing how easy it is to deploy a cloud solution, we can deploy a digital regulatory sandbox in about 3 days for a central bank. That's how easy it is now. We know how to configure the processes, and the tools that we use make that very, very seamless. We work with them in understanding their processes and in configuring for them. However, in the requirements to go live, the UAT testing, very much ingrained into what we build. And as they get consultation from other partners and they get advisors coming in, doing audits and doing review, they complement the gap that they have in a particular way. But one thing that we saw is, you know, some very targeted requirements, for example, to go live versus another central bank that has a larger IT department, if you will, and that already has a cloud strategy. There were over 100 requirements of in order for us to go live. And working through that, working with the IT team, the collaboration, a much bigger IT team, and the requirements of collaboration across the department internally to make sure that we deliver and pass UAT test and so on. So that's the difference that we saw. Less capacity building in that case. The team that we're working with leveraged their IT, the internal IT team, to give them support and guidance on how to implement a new software and pass some checks. Especially if you think about SaaS products and versus a licensed product. That's something that we also had to educate. But surprisingly, we're seeing regulators understanding more and more how to manage SaaS offerings versus license and the costs related to it as well.
Thank you, Carmel. Yeah, thank you for the insights here. Over to you, Sam, for the same question. How can smaller, less well-resourced agencies consider this question as opposed to the larger, maybe more well?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. We work with regulators of all sizes. So one of our smaller regulators regulates 40 banks. We have another large regulator that regulates over 46,000 financial institutions. The decision whether to go or the ability to go cloud or on premise generally is legislation based. So depending on the jurisdiction, they may have laws that says their data cannot leave their jurisdiction, or their data cannot leave their on-premise data center, et cetera, et cetera. So really, irrespective of the size, it depends on, obviously cloud-based is more turnkey and easier to deploy, but that may not always be possible. As far as the size of the organization, that's where economies of scale and financial wherewithal comes in. Some organization obviously can only afford a certain price solution, whereas a larger jurisdiction, money's no object. What is the best solution on the market? What is the best architecture? What is the best? We want the best of the best. Cost is less of a concern. Organizations that are smaller can reduce some of the costs by adopting the same solution, but doing some of the work themselves. Whether it's the historic data migration, or whether it's being taught how to configure the solution. So maybe we deliver phase one for them, but then they get into our training session and learn how to configure our own solution so they can deliver future phases themselves. Where a larger organization doesn't want to stake their learning curve and their own people's availability in the middle of the project timelines and potential success. So they will offload all the configuration and all the development to the vendor, and they just want a complete end-to-end, well-integrated solution. So I would say it's more, depending on the parameters and depending on the limitations, organization jurisdictions can become more resourceful and determine what do you absolutely have to buy because I have no other choice. I can't build it, or it's going to cost too much to do everything ourselves. So what can I afford to buy, and what, with my existing set of skills and resources, what can I supplement internally?
Great, thank you both. Yeah, I'm hearing a few factors here, right? That generally the factors don't necessarily differ drastically, but the progress toward those different factors might differ, right? Like the ability to deploy in the cloud, for instance, or in a hybrid environment, the ability to afford something at a given juncture. So it sounds to me like these are elements that would justify putting together a roadmap where you're considering resources along the path and maturity levels of your infrastructure along the path and your timelines and budget and everything else along this. So yeah, thank you for those components. I have one more question, and then I do see there are a couple of questions in the chat here that I'd like to get to. So we've talked about the what and the why a little bit of build versus buy, or this spectrum. We haven't talked a whole lot about the who. So in your experiences, who are the key actors that should be involved in this decision-making or road mapping process that we kind of just touched on? for building in-house or working with an external provider or some combination of these? Yeah, who are the decision makers and who needs to be kind of consulted along this journey?
Do you want to start? I
It's
Go
up
ahead.
to you. Okay. Obviously, you need to involve your IT department or the head of IT, because at the end of the day, you're making a technology purchase or you're building in-house, and you need to know, the technical capabilities of your team. You need to map the requirements to functionality, to what's available on the market, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously the IT needs to be involved. Heads of supervisions needs to be involved, because, banking doesn't have the exact, heads of banking supervision don't have the exact same requirements as heads of on-site examination, etc. So you need to involve every division's heads, and you need to gather all the requirements, uh, in order to evaluate properly. Obviously, you need to involve procurement, because they set the rules, etc. Um, but more importantly, you need to do proper research, and I don't know who in the organization is going to spearhead the research, but the research can go from, what's available on the market as far as buyer's guide, who are the key players that I need to involve in my demos and evaluations. Vendors are more than happy to share with you their functional requirements matrix, so you could take all these and have it form your ultimate set of requirements. But definitely both the business and IT need to be hand in hand involved in this process, and in order to make the right choice as to whether to buy or build, and is it cost effective, and what is the total cost of ownership, and what is the ROI of either decision. So you can't really separate the two.
Yeah, I would say that it really depends on the organization. We've seen different teams kind of taking the lead, but oftentimes it's about having a dedicated team that's going to take on the project. We've seen that work very specifically where it comes from the top, at least a decision to take on a project, but having a dedicated team that is working together cross-functional across the organization to get input, but having a focal decision point on who do you engage with in the final decision, like Sam said, really having IT understanding the current technology stack and the requirements and dependencies and any technology rules that they have and policies that they have internally, making sure that you're abiding to that. We've had to do show our pen testing, our SOC, certificates, and how do we continue to provide security and so on, and doing demos and actively presenting across the organization what the solution is for that decision to be made.
Great, thank you both for that incredibly insightful inputs here. I think this is awesome to see. There's a ton of questions coming through in the chat, so I think we'll shift to this. I'm going to try to do some magic here and combine 3 of these questions into a common theme, and then ask you guys to elaborate. And I do want to leave time for kind of 1-minute responses to a couple specific questions I have for each of you at the end. So there are 3 related questions. Number one, somebody asked about, Jack asked about a couple of specific examples of successful built initiatives. Another is around how do we square this idea that potentially the State of SupTech report had mentioned supervisors and agencies include concerns around lock-in as part of their conversation. And why is that the case? Why is that a risk, vendor lock-in? And then third, are there certain cases that are easier to develop compared to buying them, or make more sense in the long term? So I'd like to share a little bit of my own insight, and then I'll ask you guys to elaborate. But The two examples that I like to use to consider these are the Central Bank of the Philippines with the RegTech for Regulators Accelerator, the precursor of the lab. We worked together to develop, with a vendor initially, an API solution for compliance reporting for prudential supervision, along with a dashboard and everything else. So there was a vendor there that was building this solution, did a phenomenal job of collecting all of the requirements, really bringing down tens of thousands of person hours per year to, you know, a few hundred. So we collected KPIs along the way as well. This was an incredibly transformational project. That at the end of this, the terms of that engagement were that the solution provider was going to provide a copy of the object and source code of the solution, such that the agency could decide to build upon this. They could decide to keep working with the same vendor to customize this solution. But that's an example of like a solution that was initially bought to get over a certain hump, with an option then to kind of fork whether we're going to continue to pay a license or a maintenance contract, or whether we're going to take this on ourselves and continue to like build this and expand it maybe across other supervisory areas. Now that's a rule-based system, right? Like you set up some rules and the APIs are validating information coming in automatically and cleaning up the data. Now, in my perspective, like model-based systems, things that are doing like topic modeling or sentiment analysis on social media data, which has rules that are changing every day, is an area where, you know, if you're building this solution, you're necessarily dedicating, you know, members of the team to kind of keeping this thing maintained, keeping the models up to date, ensuring that you're updating, you know, your integrations with social media and web scraping and things like this. So I think that these kind of two ends of a spectrum are how I view this technical distribution, that there are certain things that are like relatively straightforward to reduce vendor lock-in, turn over to an agency to continue to develop. There are other areas that require tremendous amounts of maintenance, upgrades, patches, things like this, because the real world is dynamic. And those ones may not be locking you into a vendor, but benefit tremendously from working with somebody who you can kind of pass that risk and expertise and cost to. So I'd love to hear, yeah, each of your thoughts, maybe in a minute on this kind of spectrum of tooling and in your own context.
Carmel, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. Again, you know, we don't obviously get involved in too many builds, given that we're a software vendor that sells a ready-made solution or a configurable solution. But even in our own development evolution and life cycle, we do depend on other vendors, and we do integrate with other vendors, and we're not really locked in with anybody because we typically develop modules, that standalone modules that do the connection to that vendor or that API set of APIs. So I could switch XBRL processing engines tomorrow without impacting my application and my functionality. I could switch BI tools the next day because, again, it's operating on data. I prep the data and make the data available. Any reporting tool will work fine on it, and so on. So I think that vendor locking obviously can be an issue if you bring their code and their functionality and have it touch many of your modules or many of your own 10,000 lines of code. But if you isolate the APIs to smaller modules or a specific central area, then you can easily swap out a vendor if you need to. But we don't really get involved in custom builds per se. We've developed a platform that's configurable, that doesn't really require, if you choose us, then you're using us to configure what you need. You don't need to really add any custom code.
And Matt, I'd be curious to hear the end result of the Philippines project. my background before MTech, I was at IBM for over 10 years. It's that kind of selling software is what we did to big enterprises and complicated deals and so on. The concept of buying a source code also brings us back to, okay, do you have the team internally? What are you going to do with that? Because I can imagine if you're a vendor and you have to sell your source code of something that you could potentially monetize, I could imagine that it would cost a lot. You would want to charge a lot to do that. So in that decision of buy versus build, what are the benefits maybe that you saw on a particular central bank buying a source code from a vendor, because it is a big decision for a vendor to sell their source code, and the decision to actually buy it and what it takes to scale it up?
Yeah, I think it depends completely on the business model, and this is kind of what each of you have said, right? It depends on the approach of the software. There are business models where people completely open source everything they do, and their model is more of a services model. I'm going to help you maintain this. I'm going to help you expand it when you need to. I'll be a consultant when you need to. These are equally vendors of solutions within the SupTech space, and it's a viable model. The Red Hat Linux model proved this, decades ago. But yeah, and then other vendors may say, no, like really, I have this proprietary machine learning algorithm, this very proprietary way of approaching this. So we are just about at time. Can I just ask in 30 seconds, I have one question for each of you. Maybe we'll start with Sam. So there's a question about effectively, like, how can you inspire people? There's evidence out here that procurement can be a very lengthy and arduous process for vendors. How can you inspire people to overcome this and remain in this space and realize the impact that we want to see here? So please, if you can keep it to 30 seconds.
Remain in the build. How do you inspire people to build?
How do you remain as a vendor in the SupTech space in general, and overcome these challenges of lengthy procurement processes, maybe a lot of negotiations up front before seeing a contract and
Yeah, absolutely. The buying cycle is lengthy. It could be as much as 3, 4, 5 years. How do you stay involved, viable, and profitable is by having many irons in the fire. You can't really control that client's buying cycle. You can't say, if you buy by the end of March, we will give you a 20% discount. That doesn't work in our industry. So the client is completely in charge of the time frames, and you just have to make sure you have enough opportunities on the front burner so that you're agile enough to respond whenever the client is ready to purchase.
Great. Sage advice, Sam. Thank you so much. So Carmel, to wrap us up, there's a question from Elia that I think is really critical. It's often understated, but in this niche industry, women are both underrepresented as founders and CEOs, as well as in public procurement spend. So is there any insight that you'd be comfortable sharing when it comes to overcoming these challenges, breaking into this space, becoming a prominent name in this space, and increasing representation?
Yeah, I have to really give kudos to my team as well. But you're absolutely right. Kind of starting a company like this, going into the SupTech and walking in to talk to governors or deputy governors of a central bank and trying to sell them technology is not particularly something that they see every day. But what we anchored on is really understanding the client, understanding the problem. That's something that is done a lot. We were talking before, there are very few providers in this space. Most people don't wake up and wanting to build for a supervisor or for a regulator. That's just not attractive to most compared to starting a gaming app, if you will. But we saw something. We saw the impact that central banking has. And my pitch and my approach is really being very clear and convinced about the role that we can play in enabling them and solving their problem, making them better. But yes, as you probably can validate, I think I'm the only Black woman founder CEO in this space. I don't want to overstate that, but I think I'm the only one. And the journey has been really anchoring on understanding the problem and really putting a best foot forward to try to provide a solution into this space and add value. It really comes down to the client. And once you sit down and kind of really understand that, then you engage. And the no's are the no's. You're going to get no's all the time, but the yeses, you make sure that you deliver and do a good job.
Great. Carmel, Sam, thank you so much for helping us to unpack this spectrum. And thank you, Simone, for your patience. I saw you come on screen. We're going to turn it over to you, but thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your insights, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care.
Carmel, Sam, thank you so much for sharing some of the secrets of your business. And Matt, thank you for the facilitation. So buy versus build. I am sure I will miss some of the dimensions that needs to be brought into the decision, but what I took as notes is look at the legislation. Sometimes it's even the legislation that doesn't leave a choice of buying versus build. We talk about, for example, around the data, whether it can be ported into clouds that are not so hosted in the country. Time to development, time to get the solutions ready. Of course, budget, and it was very interesting, I think, how Sammy broke down the different budget structures of the buy versus build upfront and not costs. So I think something that we will go back and look at again to really download it and broke it down. And the capacity of expertise, do we really have in-house the expertise and the capabilities to build the solutions? A point that I had not that is absolutely important, like the IP of the supervisory methodologies and what can be and wants to be shared with the vendors, and then looking around for open source components that can really take the price, the cost of development down. Drew, these were my points. I don't know if there is anything you want to add as we transition into the next session.
I had noted many of those as well, and I also just really appreciated the components around resourcefulness. So if one does not have full resources, what does that mean in terms of timeline, or where do you focus on? And this gets back to really focusing on the needs. So it's always good to drive that point home, which I thought was quite appropriate. With that.